but he's out of town on business, and so I'm filling in. My name's Bob Turner. I'm the publisher of the Bradenton Herald. I have a couple of announcements before we get started, if you will. First of all, I want to tell you about our September meeting. The meeting date has been rescheduled to Thursday the 8th of September. It's going to be a 9/11 program. We're going to have Kathy Gilbert, Executive Vice President of Silverstein Properties, who held all the leases on the World Trade Center at the time of the collapse of the tragedy. Sheriff Brad Stubbe is going to speak about changes in the department that have taken place, and also Rick Piccolo from Sarasota Bradenton Airport is going to talk about the changes there since 9/11. It ought to be a very, very good program, so I hope you'll all attend. I want to remind you also of the friends only rule. If you would like to ask a question from the floor, you must be a friend of Tiger Bay, which means you've joined and paid your membership fee. So let's please honor that rule, if you will. And one final thing, your cell phones. If you could turn your cell phones on vibrate only. If you get a call in the middle of the program, please wait to speak until you get outside of the room. And I and the speakers would greatly appreciate that. Today we're going to explore the new Florida election laws and the redistricting in the state of Florida. On the new voter laws, we've passed new and tighter requirements for voter registration, and they've been implemented. It sounds like a good thing, is it? We also have passed a pair of constitutional amendments by a majority of voters to help create fair districts, but lawsuits have been filed, and the taxpayers are going to pay to both defend and to litigate those amendments. So what do you think about that? To talk about these topics today, our panel of experts includes Pamela Goodman, to my far left, First Vice President of the Florida League of Women Voters, Dr. Craig Trigueiro, President of the Lakewood Ranch Republican Club and former Vice Chairman of the Republican Executive Committee. On my far right, Richard O'Brien, Chairman of the Manatee County Democratic Party, and to my immediate right, Bob Sweat, the Manatee County Supervisor of Elections. Very knowledgeable group on a tough topic. I'm sure we'll have some lively but civil discussion. Each panelist will have 5 minutes to cover both topics, and that's pretty demanding, so please give them their 5 minutes and make sure you're listening at the time. If you are a member, of course, you can ask a question at the end of all of the speakers speaking. So we'll have 20 minutes of speakers, then we'll open the floor up to questions. You may ask your question to any or all of the panelists today. And so without further ado, let's get started. I'd like to welcome to the podium Bob Sweat.
Thank you for the applause. You may not applaud when I sit down, but that was a good start. Before I get started, let me just make a couple of comments that's interesting to me. I think probably the Tiger Bay Club missed a window of opportunity today. Instead of inviting me here, they probably should have had the legislators here. They're the ones that wrote the laws and signed and passed the laws. And I think it would have been nice if we'd have had them here to explain to us what they did, because I don't understand them all yet. But I will tell you that, as in the past, laws have come down to my office over the years, some good, some bad. But what I've always tried to do, and we will continue to do that this time, if somebody gives me a bag of lemons, I'm going to make some lemonade out of it for the best protection of the voters that I can, and that's what we're going to do with these laws. Excuse me. We have really 4 sections of this law that is probably the major concerns of most of us based on the phone calls that I've had and the articles that I've read in the newspaper. On May 19th, 2011, the governor signed into law Chapter 2011-40, which was commonly known as 1355, House Bill 1355. It has approximately 80 sections in it, 4 of which seems to be very controversial. Most of the rest of them is administrative duties for me and the supervisors here in the state of Florida. So I want to try briefly to go over several of these with you, the four that I have picked out that I have had the most calls on. One, the first is Section 4 of the bill, is third-party voter registration organizations. This bill has some language in it that is pretty tough on those of you in the community and statewide that like to go out and register voters, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or just an interested party that likes to go out and get as many people registered to vote as they can. That has been one of my goals ever since I've been in office, and we have always had very good success and great cooperation from most of the people in Manatee County that go out and do third-party registrations. However, in 2000, 2002, and 2004, we had some really outlaws come into Manatee County in the state of Florida that was out registering people. Big sign on the back of their car said, you know, register to vote here. I don't know what happened to the applications once they registered to vote, but we had a lot of people calling our office saying, I registered to vote on the corner of 19th and 44th, and I haven't gotten my cards yet. Or I registered to vote 3 weeks ago, and I haven't gotten my cards yet. Now, that was pretty widespread back then. Since that time, most of these people do not come back to Florida anymore, and we've had very good success with our local people, like the Republican and Democratic parties and the League of Women Voters, helping us to register new voters. This bill, was it necessary? Portions of it was, because I think we needed some restrictions on who could come in here and handle the voter registration and get it into my office and to the state in a timely manner. Before, we had 10 days, we meaning y'all, the registering folks, you had 10 days to get the applications into us and we could process them. What happened was the closer it got to the election, the fewer and fewer applications we were getting in, and then sometimes the last day for the registration, we would get 200 dumped on us. And then that was a major chore for us to get those things processed and get them out to the voters by the time the election came along. Now, remember one thing in processing voter registration applications, they are not all 100% right. So if there's an error on there, just one, if there's an error on that application, I have to take that, send it back to the party that signed it and filled it out and the address that I had, and then we're talking about another 10-day process involved in this, and a lot of times these folks are not getting their cards back until maybe 20 days before the election, and that generates a lot of calls and a lot of curiosity. Now, you have 48 hours if you're registering voters, and you have to be certified through an application to the state as a third-party registration agency. Now, 48 hours from the time that a person signs, dates, and puts the time that they sign the affidavit. And there seems to be the controversy because there are a bunch of fines, and I'm not going to go into that, but there's a bunch of fines associated with these things being late and a person holding on to them and not getting them into us. So that bill really is a double-edged sword. It really stops a lot of people that are very interested in the democratic system to go out and get people registered to vote, and versus somebody that comes in and has no concerns or anything about Manatee County, registers people to vote, and then they're not too particular where they turn in the applications or not. So I'm going to go over that really quick so I can cover the other three. A petition signature verification, that only covers any petitions that people are out signing to get something on the ballot. If they and what happened with that is anything after May 19th only has a shelf life of 2 years. Prior to that date, it had a shelf life of 4 years. Is that good or bad? I don't know. I think people move, and we have a very transient, if you've lived here very long, you know we have a very transient society here in Manatee County. So a person could sign a petition affidavit, if you think back on the pig, you know, keeping a pig in a pen or whatever it was several years ago. If they signed that, they could be in Timbuktu by the time that the 4 years was up and the time somebody wanted to go back and verify the signature on that other than my office. So that's probably not a bad, it's probably not a bad bill, and it certainly doesn't affect any of us drastically. The 4 year period is if you turned in 200,000 or 100,000 3 years ago, and now you got a year left to go, then that helps you, but because you don't have as many to get. So, but in the 2-year period that you have now for a shelf life of those things, I don't know that that's really all that bad. The other controversial part of the bill was Section 26 relating to out-of-county address changes. I don't have any idea why they put this in the law. We have, with the database that we currently have in Tallahassee, we can track a voter pretty darn good. So if you move into Manatee County and you have not changed your party by election day, if you go to the polls to vote, 2 things that you need to make sure of. One is that you're in the right precinct. Now, if you're new to Manatee County, I don't have any idea how you're going to find out unless you call our office. And if you call our office, you're going to know about this new bill. Secondly, now all you need to do is fax, email, or call our office to make an address change. So if you're moving into the county, and this is one of the things that we will work very hard on to get the word out for new people coming into Manatee County. If you live in Manatee County and you've moved from one address to the other, it doesn't matter. But if you move into Manatee County and have not changed your address from Sarasota or Port Charlotte or wherever, it's not that you're not going to get a chance to vote. We are going to let you vote a provisional ballot, and then we will research that data. And if in fact you have not voted in the county that you came from, and you voted here in Manatee County, then the canvassing board will look at that information, and they will allow you to go ahead and honor that and count that provisional ballot. The next one is Section 39, and this seems to be the most controversial one that I've gotten phone calls on, and that is the relating to early voting. You know, used to we had 14 days of early voting prior to each one of the elections, and the legislature has changed that now to 8 days. Now they left the 96 days, the 96 hours that you have to set up early voting, and I am in the process right now of adjusting some of the hours for the elections that we're going to have coming up here. If you're worried about the general election, and that's as far as I've gotten so far in looking back at the statistical data, we will open the polls for those 8 days, 12 hours a day, just like election day, 12 hours for 8 days. Now, one of the calls, several of the calls that I've had, but the one issue that came up is we don't have 2 Sundays to vote, or we don't have 2 Saturdays to vote. Well, you know, like I do, and a lot of times when these bills come down, I have to make arrangements and I have to change some scheduling. The only thing that I think is going to affect some of our voters for early voting is the fact that they're going to have to change their schedule and realize that they only have 1 Sunday or 1 Saturday to get their people out to the polls and vote. So I think that's going to be the most controversial thing that we have out there that we're looking at. Let me say that this bill became effective on the day that the governor signed it and signed the bill, except for 5 counties, and those are 5 pre-clearance counties that we have here in the state: Collier, Hardy, Hendry, Hillsborough, and Monroe. And everything that goes, every law that is written that goes into effect has to be pre-cleared by the Justice Department, and that is what we're waiting on right now. I had a call yesterday from someone who said, well, what happens if the Justice Department does not pre-clear those 5 counties? How does it affect you? Well, unless the governor makes some kind of change in his decision and the legislature addresses this, it's not going to make any difference to us because we are not a pre-clearance county. So right now, that's where we stand, and I'm sure there's going to be some questions, so I'm going to sit down and let the next person go. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, Bob, you're a bad boy. You busted the budget. So please, to the rest of you presenters, please try to stick to 5 minutes. Bob was the one that told me he didn't think he could even fill 5 minutes. No, you did an excellent job. Thank you very much. Mr. O'Brien.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here. It's the first time that we've had a sitting Democratic chief at the Trigueiro Bay Club, but I think you guys are only about 6 months old, so it's a good start. In the capacity as the head of the local Democratic Party, I'm often in a position where we have to be partisan on issues. Now, that wasn't very difficult to do in the last legislative session in Tallahassee. I'm sure that there was some legislation that was bipartisan, but off the top of my head, I just can't think of any that was in this past session. We had a very conservative legislative session in Tallahassee this time around. One of the three most conservative in the nation, and arguably the most conservative in 75 years here in Florida. For the past 40 years, there's been a bipartisan effort to grow the voter base here. People live hectic lives. People are very busy. And so Bob Sweat, and I certainly don't want to speak for Bob Sweat, but Bob and the SOEs across the state and a lot of citizens groups have tried to increase the voter base. And they've tried to increase voter registration. That's how Motor Voter got passed. It was basically a bipartisan effort. Now, it's a sign of a mature democracy when you try to expand your Democratic base as much as possible. I teach a class at USF. I teach 3 classes, in fact, and one of them is called World Ideologies. And world ideologies, we talk about authoritarian regimes and pseudo-democracies and new democracies. But the first third of the class is American liberalism. Now, you might think that because I'm a liberal, that has to do with being a progressive, but it doesn't. American liberalism is about American freedom, that we have the most important ideology in the world of the past 200 years, that there are countries and civilizations all around the world that try to emulate what we do here in the United States. And I think it's important to just touch base on this a little bit because this act that we're talking about today that's been popularly referred to as the Voter Suppression Act of 2011 here in Florida, look on the internet. I mean, it's out there. The reason why the Republicans, and not necessarily all the rank and file Republicans, but some of the more conservative members of this legislature said that this was necessary was to prevent voter fraud. Now, I don't know about you, but I remember a little election in 2000 where there were some voter issues. I also remember a local election in 2006 where a gal named Christine Jennings just lost by the smallest amount of margins, and yet there were 18,000 votes that were discounted. There wasn't a rush by the ultra-conservatives to rush to resolve the voter fraud issue at that time. So you got to ask yourself, or at least I ask myself, why now? So the why now question, I believe, is tied up with the Republican Party being at their zenith. Here in the state of Florida, the Republican Party is absolutely at the apogee, the penultimate level of their influence in the state legislature. I mean, I want you to think about it for a sec. There are 600,000 more Democrats in the state, and yet the Republican legislature is 70% in the state Senate and almost 70% in the state House of Representatives. So the pendulum is about to swing back, especially with 5 and 6 passing. If that's adjudicated properly and put into effect, then some of those districts are going to come back the Democratic way. It is in the interest of the Republicans in Tallahassee and Rick Scott to halt the momentum of that pendulum swinging back. Now, when we talk about fair redistricting, we had a Secretary of State named Kurt Browning. Now, I know he's Secretary of State today, but Kurt Browning literally resigned in the last few months of his term to start an organization that raised $4 million to defeat redistricting 5 and 6. Now, as the newly re-sworn-in Secretary of State, Kurt Browning is in a position to enforce those laws which he does not want to enforce. And so every bit of tamping down on the new laws that you voted for by a 63% approval are being turned aside by the state. They're trying to take it to court. They're trying to do everything to throw up roadblocks to have proper adjudication of that fair redistricting. So now my theory, and I'm only echoing what's commonplace, is that this Voter Suppression Act is a way to chip away at Democratic demographics. Here in Manatee County in 2010, we won 1 day of the early voting, and we only won it by 3 votes. Now, you might not be proud of that. I'm proud of that because we don't win much around here as Democrats. But that day was the day, the Sunday, about a minute? Okay. That day was the Sunday that the African-American churches, when they came out of the churches, buses came to near the churches, picked up people, and brought them to the polls. It's a tradition going back 40 years. Without those Sundays, that's going to hurt African-American turnout. By requiring address changes to be done 29 or 27 days before the election, that's going to hurt student turnover, which was the backbone of the Democratic victory in 2008. Married women and newly married women, which vote overwhelmingly Democratic, are the most likely people not to have their name changed incorrectly on Election Day. So there are point after point after point where this bill is clear suppression. And usually you look at the guy speaking and say, oh, well, he's a Democratic chief. But you look at some of the folks on the stage, the League of Women Voters and the groups that have come and said that this is not proper, and it's across the board. And hopefully we'll get into some more of this in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well done. Dr. Trigueiro.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And it's actually Trigueiro, but I'll answer to a lot of different names. Since it's Tiger Bay, I guess I can be somewhat politically incorrect. On the amendments, I think the Bradenton Herald summed it up when they said, paraphrase law of physics, that a body in motion will stay in motion, and that a party in power wants to stay in power. That's what the amendments are about. That's what the litigation's about. I voted for both amendments. I will not try and defend them. Although it will be interesting to see what happens. So I think it's Betty Castor's district. She comes into Manatee County and picks up some heavily Democratic votes. So if they get rid of gerrymandering, we'll see what happens to her Democratic votes. I thought I was listening to the script of Alice in Wonderland when when Mr. O'Brien was speaking. I call it the Voter Integrity Act. I also call it the Anti-Voter Fraud Act, and I also call it the ACORN Act, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now. ACORN, in the last election, committed voter fraud across the United States, and it was indicted for voter fraud across the United States, and was probably the first nail in their coffin. They practice Chicago-style politics, and given the fact that Barack Hussein Obama Jr. used to be a community organizer for ACORN and an attorney for ACORN, I'm not sure if that explains why they were so pro-democratic, because ACORN, while not a democratic entity and is supposed to be non-political, is a 95+% Democratic voter. Rules and laws are never made for those who obey them. They are made for those who do not. And that's why we have these laws. Now, you have to have a photo ID, a valid one. You can't write a check, a personal check at a grocery store without a valid Florida driver's license. You cannot get on a commercial airline in the United States without a valid ID. So why should you be able to vote? As far as this being voter suppression or discrimination, discrimination is when you pick something different from another group of people and you use that to separate them from you, and you discriminate against them. These laws don't just apply to African Americans. They don't just apply to Democrats. They apply to all of us. And if we all play by the same rules, where's the problem? It was interesting that he mentioned the busing, because when we were both quoted in a newspaper article and about changing the 14 days to 8 days, and they would lose the Sundays. So I asked a Republican activist who's an attorney about churches being involved in politics. And he said that if the church itself was actively involved in the politics, in other words, African-American churches somehow getting their congregation, and I've worshiped at an African-American church, and they're 95% plus African-American, getting that voter demographics to get on a bus to go vote, that's not get out the vote, that's get out the partisan Democratic vote. And if a church is doing that, they may well violate IRS law and lose their 501c3 not-for-profit status. As far as the litigation costs go, in Manatee County, we know we had the school board of Manatee County suing the Board of Commissioners when they wanted to put MTI where the school board wanted it and not where the people did, and that was another example of voters and taxpayers voting to sue themselves. I don't personally have, we'll do the voter registration thing. Rules apply to everyone, as he said. If it weren't for the registration of dead voters and non-existent people and people from other states, we wouldn't have this law. Mr. Sweat told you that we've already had voter fraud in Manatee County. As a physician, I can tell you there are fake IDs out there. So actually proving that you are who you are and that you have a legal right to vote protects the sanctity of your vote. I'm in favor of everybody voting who's informed. And I think that as a general rule in the United States, we have pretty puny turnout for voting, given people who are in Iraq who, when they voted, had mortars and bullets flying at them. And by the way, you ever wonder about their purple thumb that they so proudly held up? Why did they do that? That was to prevent voter fraud, because you're only allowed to have one purple thumb on you in Iraq when you vote. And when you show up to vote, if you have a purple thumb, you don't get the vote. I really don't have much more to say about it. To me, it's pretty clear. It's about equal justice under the law, and the fact that the Lady Justice in front of the Supreme Court that's holding the scales of justice is blindfolded. These rules apply to all of us. You can't discriminate against any entity if the rules apply to every one of us. And voter suppression to me was the photograph on the TV news of two Black Panthers dressed in their uniforms, standing in front of a doorway into a building where there was a polling station, and I believe it was in Philadelphia. And one of the Black Panthers had a club, and he was doing this. Now, I consider that voter intimidation, voter suppression. The Justice Department under Eric Holder didn't think so, and doesn't think so, and has not even pursued it. This is about us as Americans exercising our legitimate right to vote. It's not about suppressing votes. If you're worried about voting, start your organization 30 days earlier.
Appreciate it very much. Okay, thank you. Dr. Trigueiro. Did I get it right that time?
No, but you're getting closer.
Closer every time. Pamela Goodman from the League of Women Voters.
Thank you. I didn't want to waste any of my precious time by walking up to the podium. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I came over from the East Coast, Palm Beach County, to be with you today, and I think this is my 4th trip over here, and it's always a pleasure to come to this side of the coast. I think everyone's done eating, so if I can just get your attention for 1 second, I want to ask 3 simple questions. First question, who voted last November in the election? Raise your hand. Terrific. Who voted in favor of Amendments 5 and 6 to stop gerrymandering in the state of Florida? Terrific. And who of you has been a part of personally or has known an organization or an individual who has been a participant or strategically planned voter fraud in the state of Florida? None of you. Enough said. That's my point. Being a nonpartisan representative, I choose to take the position of not agreeing with either Richard or the doctor. I agree with mostly what the supervisor said. I won't call it voter suppression. I won't call it election reform or voter support. I won't call it election reform. This bill is not election reform. It is election regression that takes us back before the year 2000 and that abominable election. This is not a bill for voter support and voter rights. This is a bill about voter suppression and taking away the rights of every U.S. American citizen to vote in this country. That's what this 152-page bill that was presented the last 2 weeks of legislative session with no input from civic groups like my own, the Nonpartisan League of Women Voters, no input from Supervisor of Elections who run elections across this state. But you're right, Mr. Sweat, the legislators themselves rammed this through the last 2 weeks of session, turned a 4-page bill into a 152-page bill. And you've heard about some of the worst things that are in this bill. I want to give you some enlightenment on just a couple of extra things. There is one good thing. I always believe in talking, starting out with a positive and then putting a negative in the middle and ending with a positive. So that was my negative. Let me tell you one positive thing about this bill. we were talking about the voter registration cards. On page 200 and whatever of this bill, section 200, you now, on your voter registration card, when you get it, will actually be told where to go to vote, where your precinct is. Yay, that is a great thing. That's about the only good thing that we can find in this bill. Let me enlighten you on some of the others that weren't mentioned. We talked about citizen initiatives, and you all know that Amendments 5 and 6 was a citizen initiative. We knew that it took 4 years to get 1.6 million petitions signed to get this on the ballot. It took us that 4 years of hard work. Do you know what is in this 152-page bill? Not just cutting back any future citizen initiatives to 2 years, but giving the legislature more leeway to take what they want to put on amendments on the bill, the ability to do it. If you remember Amendment 7, we called it the poison pill amendment. That was the amendment that the legislature themselves put on to defeat and nullify Amendments 5 and 6. It got defeated because it was proven unconstitutional by the court that reviewed it. But there's been other amendments, both citizen initiatives and legislature amendments, that if the wording is not exactly correct, if it's over the amount of word count, that's a reason to get it stricken also. The legislature poses an amendment to the courts now, according to this bill, and it is deemed incorrect wording, misrepresentational, has to be thrown off of the ballot. They get to take it back. They get a do-over. It goes back to the legislature. They can rewrite it, make it good, send it back to the courts until they get it right. The legislature will have the final say and can keep submitting an amendment now. Do we have that choice? No. Who wins here? Citizens with citizen initiatives, or the legislature one more time giving themselves more power and more control over what we as citizens take? Another piece of enlightenment. The appointed Secretary of State, and the Supervisor didn't talk about this, he mentioned Kurt Browning. He is our appointed Secretary of State. He, in this bill, has now been given jurisdiction over all of our Supervisor of Elections. Mr. Sweat, he doesn't take information from us, God forbid, the citizens, not from the governor, from an appointed Secretary of State, who we have seen, as you pointed out, has been on both sides of this coin. Now, Kurt Browning has done some terrific things under our former governor, Charlie Crist, with voting, and he's done some just as horrible things under his current governor, Scott. So Kurt Browning seemingly does not have a position of his own as Secretary of our state. Is that really my time? Just a couple other things that I do want to mention, because I don't want to end on a negative. And I do want to get into the pre-clearance issue. Mr. Sweat mentioned that we're waiting for the Department of Justice to pre-clear this election bill. And he said, unless the governor does something. It happened 3 days ago, Mr. Sweat. The governor and the Secretary of State, after the League of Women Voters with Democracia had submitted 2 letters, one to them directly and one with our lawyers, our pro bono counsel, to the Department of Justice, alerting them and asking the Department of Justice not to clear this election bill. 2 weeks after we submitted that letter, the governor and the Secretary of State has pulled this bill from pre-clearance from the Department of Justice and has now filed it in federal court for their approval, saying that they wanted a clear, non-misrepresentational verdict on this bill. So it has already been changed. It has already been pulled. It is mystifying, is it? Why that was not pulled from the current administration's Department of Justice clearance and now put into a federal court. The positive is that we're here. We're all talking about these issues today, and I do want to get into redistricting and that lawsuit, but I'm sure that will come up when we get into discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I wasn't going to try to get her off the podium, tell you right now. Okay, members can come forward and ask questions. Please address your question to the individual you'd like to respond, or if you'd like the whole panel to respond one at a time, we'll come up with an order for that. So, any questions? Great.
Could somebody address what the fines are for failure to submit the registrations in a timely manner?
I can address just briefly. The short answer to the question, and one of the reasons that the League of Women Voters has ceased doing voter registration for the first time in 92 years in the state of Florida is because it's fuzzy math. We're not exactly sure. In the bill, it holds everybody from myself, who sits on the state board of directors, to local league board members liable, fiduciarily liable, and it's very, very unclear. Taken in its worst case, it could bankrupt a 100% volunteer organization like my own. So they're not meager, they're not small, and the real problem is that they're not clear.
In the language of the bill, it says the fines will be between $50 and $500 per day, per episode. Now they're trying to tighten that up, but just to give you an idea, we wanted to continue doing voter registration as we've been doing since the defeat in the last election. And we have this guy, Albert, that got a bunch of voter registration forms, and he accidentally put 2 of them on the back of a clipboard. And he didn't discover it until he went out the next week. Now that's 7 days. That would have been at least a $700, at the very minimum, a $700 fine. So the Florida Democratic Party simply put out a call to cease all voter registration activity. That's never happened before because the fines are so staggering. So when it's called the Voter Suppression Act, I mean, there are things that it absolutely and clearly suppresses. And we'd love to go out there, but you really have to have your I's dotted and your T's crossed. The one other thing I want to say about that is that they say you have to have it turned in within 48 hours. But that's not exactly true. If you take it in, if you take a voter registration form in at 10 o'clock Saturday morning, you have to have that in at 10:01 Monday. So the business hours that you have, that's not even 48 hours, that's an hour. So it really is oppressive to trying to get the voter registration done.
Good afternoon, Jim Delgado. Thank you all for being here. My question is, in the times when we're talking about cutbacks, saving money, counties are having to save money, law enforcement, fire, education, why is it that the Senate increased their budget by 26%, which equals $9 million, and the House has over $30 million to fight the bill that we all voted for? That's my question. Why is it we're using tax dollars to fight our will?
Well, Councilor Delgado, when if the legislature passes a bill and it's challenged, they have to defend themselves, right? As an attorney, if you don't defend yourself, your opponent wins no matter what, period, if you don't respond. Is that correct? If you don't respond to a lawsuit, then the judge says, okay, there's your verdict. So that's why they're doing it. And so the government is defending themselves against challenges to their law, and that's why the taxpayer money is being spent. As far as why it is now the Governor Scott administration asked the courts to rule on this instead of the Justice Department is simply, in event of a disagreement with the Justice Department's decision, it will be appealed to a court. So why not just go to a court and let the court answer it? And if anyone thinks that Eric Holder, the Attorney General of the United States, would pretend that he's Lady Justice, blinded, and make an unbiased decision, then I've got a bridge in Brooklyn I'll sell you.
I'll address the doctor's last comment first. It clearly, the reason that it was withdrawn from the Department of Justice, why do you withdraw a complaint? Why do you withdraw a comment? It was not going to go their way. The Department of Justice clearly was going to rule in favor of this bill being unconstitutional and was not going to pre-clear it. By going to the courts doesn't make it timely, comes into the equation, doesn't make it faster. Delay, delay, delay. It makes it longer. As long as this is in a court, and we all know what happens with court, more money, sir, more time, more effort, and things in disarray, voter confusion, resultant voter chaos as long as this is out there and not being dealt with. So that was their real motivation in pulling it from the Department of Justice. On the $30 million, if I can talk about that for just a second. That is one of the issues, and the redistricting hearing, by the way, is coming to your part of the world the end of this month. I hope that everyone is there and lets your thoughts be known about redistricting to the redistricting committee. We appreciate the hearings. We appreciate the fact that they're taking the time to get public input. We wish that it could be substantive and really valuable input if we had maps to comment on and start an evolutionary process of creating these district maps. But on the lawsuits, $30 million has been set aside. Just last week, a representative in Orlando, Representative Scott Randolph, asked his own legislative body, Thank you. The hearing is August 30th here. Asked his own legislative body, his own Speaker of the House, his own leader, please give me an accounting of what has been spent already for these lawsuits, of which we are fighting and defending, so that I can report that back to my constituents. The answer came back. I just got this before I came in here today. The answer that came back is that $114,000 has been spent so far as the intervener. The attorney for the House, George Lavascu, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, said, quote, in his response, once the litigation surrounding redistricting and reapportionment is concluded, the detailed billing of the legal services provided to the House will be released as required by law when they're concluded. So I'm not sure we're ever going to get a straight answer until 2012 and this is done. But it's way, way too much of our precious taxpayer dollars, as you pointed out, sir, in this time of really dire economic straits.
It's hard to follow her because she makes all the points that I would have made. She's doing a terrific job. There's a group called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And this group, you may not have heard of it, and it's a think tank. It's supposed to be a nonprofit and neutral, but it's a conservative think tank. Now, we're talking about tax dollars here. Next week, a couple dozen Florida House representatives and senators are going to be going to New Orleans, where they will be spending tax dollars that you pay into, with your taxes, for trout pontchartrain and marchand de vin sauce at $120 and $130 a plate, for a conference with what is essentially a conservative think tank. Now, the number one funders of this conservative think tank is the Koch brothers. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning it is not to pan the Tea Party movement, though I'm sure that's coming up for me soon. The reason to mention that is because the legislation that was written, this Voter Suppression Act, was largely written by ALEC, handed out to legislatures from Wisconsin and Florida. Do your own research. Just Google it and take a look. ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, is who wrote this legislation. And your taxpayer dollars are going to get your legislators that are on the right side educated on these issues so that they can better defend what is clearly a political ploy. So just keep that in mind.
Well, if somebody has a question, I'll take it. I'd like to respond to that. I'll listen to the question.
Hi. Sorry I'm late. We had a long meeting. I'm Carol Whitmore, and I am a member. I don't think anybody has been saying if they're a member or not, or their name. So I am Carol Whitmore. I am a member. I'm an elected official. I don't consider voting, I consider it's my duty. When I ran at this last election, somebody checked me out to see how many times I voted. As far back as they could say, it was 100%. I think you need to make an effort to be part of the system. And nobody's saying that today because this is totally partisan politics, which I hate. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters. Believe it or not, I'm a Republican, and I'm there. I'm one of the few Republicans. I expect the League of Women Voters to get out and get some women registered to vote. So that's not being said today. But I consider it an honor to vote, and I've proven it since I've been 18 years old. And shame on everybody that is doing things not the right way and going out and getting busloads of people to vote. Shame on you. You should be an informed voter. And that's all I got to say.
I'm glad that you brought that up, Carol. I don't know if you were here when I said that what the Democrats should do, and this is the Tiger Bay, so what the Democrats should do instead of whining is simply readjust how they do it and start their voter registration earlier and not have to rely on those 6 days, the 2 Saturdays, or the Saturday and the Sunday, that they're going to lose to bus people from African American churches to go and vote. Like I said before, we could talk philosophically about our entire system. I mean, we're like, what do we get for a turnout in a presidential year? What's our turnout, Manatee? All right, 55 or 60%, and how many of us have mortars shot at them and snipers? Well, in Iraq, they turned out about 90%. So yeah, we should all vote. We should all be informed. And if you don't have a photo ID, get it formed now. Maybe as a Republican, I shouldn't be saying this to Mr. O'Brien, but get a legal ID now. And if you're concerned about being able to register your voters, get them registered early.
Alice in Wonderland. Whining Democrats. No. A quote from earlier. No. Wouldn't think of doing that. No. The busloads of people. First of all, the buses pick people up from outside where the churches are, so that it's done legally. And they've been doing it for 40 years. And if there's anything that smacked of illegality, Bob Sweat would have been all over it because it's legal. The second thing is he talked about the massive voter fraud. There are 31 documented cases of voter fraud being brought to the courts. 3 of them ended in conviction in the past 3 years. There is no massive voter fraud. This is a non-existent issue. It's a red herring to cover what they're essentially doing, which is a very partisan act. You know, folks, voter suppression is offensive to Democrats because it's a direct assault on our access to the polls. It should be offensive to Republicans because it's been done in their name. But it should be offensive to you no matter what political party you're in because you're an American. We're not, what is it to be an American? I mean, we're not a race, we're not an ethnicity, we're not a single religion. We are people that are born of a birthright that's a commitment to freedom. And when I teach that class about American liberalism, American freedom, it's the most important thing that's happened in the past 300 years. And we've fought tooth and nail, my father and other people of his generation, against fascism and communism, and now we're fighting terrorism to protect, to make sure that our freedoms and our democracy is safe. Now, when creeping threats to our democracy, which this I believe is, occur here at home, we should guard against it, and we should be very careful when we begin making it more inconvenience, or when we start using language like it's a privilege and a right. Now, we should all be privileged to do it, but it is called a Bill of Rights. It is your absolute God-given right, not a privilege. Doesn't matter how smart you are, doesn't matter how dumb you are, doesn't matter how rich you are or poor you are, you have a right to vote. You have a right to get there. And we ought to make it with this isn't 1950. People are very, very busy right now. And it's important to try to get as much participation as possible. Thank you.
Hi, David Zaccanino. I'm a member. First of all, I want to say thanks to Bob Sweat and his office. I'm an elected official going to my 6th year. And I know Bob and his office have always bent over backwards to get people registered to vote and to increase the voter rolls. I think he's done a really good job, and I understand where he's coming from, saying this is a legislative mandate. It's kind of like one of the things we like to say in government, that this is something happening from the state, that they're an unfunded mandate. They're expecting all these things on Bob's office without consulting him or asking him. By the way, I was there that Sunday. We had the early registration, and Bob, you probably remember that day. There was a line around the block twice, and it was very, very hot. And I got into my own pocket and got some money, and people were out there for hours. And I said, Bob, can I go out and get some water from Walmart? I bought, I think, 8 cases of water, iced them down, and so people were comfortable. But when something like the League of Women Voters, who's been registering voters for 92 years, ceases to desist because something like that's happened, to me that sends up a red flag. And I you know, what Dr. Trigueiro said is that you know, the power that's in power wants to stay in power. And I think that that's part of the problem that we're having right now in politics in general, is they're just thinking of themselves, whatever party it is.
Is it? Do you have a question?
Instead of, yes, I do.
Okay.
Instead,
All right.
sorry.
Just checking.
Instead of listening to the people.
I understand.
Yeah, instead of listening to the people. So my question to the panel is this, is how can we get back to that point where we're actually trying to increase registered voters instead of playing this political game that we've been playing?
There are no prohibitions that I know of now that prevent people from registering to vote now. Now, is the 2 days pretty stringent? Yep, it's pretty stringent. Am I, as a Republican club president, we wanted to do a voter registration drive. It was my idea. And we actually would have registered anybody who stopped by. We were told that we had to do it through the county, and then it would have to go through the Republican Party of Florida, and so it makes it harder for everybody. Our answer to that is to get out the message and the drumbeat to get people to go down and register themselves. It's voter suppression. I mean, I you know, life is full of whatever you can label it, and I call it the Anti-Voter Fraud Act or the Vote Sanctity Act, and we are partisan, and so I think that it just means we're all of us are going to have to play by the same rules. All of us are going to have to work harder, and all of us are going to have to figure out how to get people to vote. I'm in favor of everybody who's knowledgeable voting. I hate for somebody to, if some people go and vote and they haven't got a clue. I think they sort of like go, yep, that, yep, no, and that's okay. If they're registered and it's legal, not the best thing in my opinion for democracy. I wonder what the professor says about that. But go and get them out and get them to vote and make them educated, but make them legal. Make them a legal voter. I don't think the Democrat Party or the League of Women Voters wants someone who is not legally entitled to be a voter, do you?
Hasn't happened, according to And thank you, Doctor. We agree with you, 100%, of course. The issue is that this fraud doesn't exist. It hasn't existed, and it's not existing today. But you're right. The solution, what can we do about it, is what we should be talking about. And we should be appalled. We should be a little angry. Normally we have our white pearls and our gloves on, the League of Women Voters, but sometimes you just have to really raise your voice and be aghast at what's happening. This bill, this election reform, election regression bill, takes us back $30 million, by the way. Mr. Sweat can tell you, the state spent for a database to ensure that voters from one county, you can't vote twice. It's virtually impossible in this state to vote twice now because of the systems that have been put in place since 2000. So this election regression bill that takes us back, this voter suppression bill, we should talk to our legislators. We should be appalled. We should express our distaste in this bill. We should ask for this federal court to not clear it in the 5 counties. That paves the way for future litigation against this bill, which of course the League is pursuing actively at this point in time. A suit has not been brought yet, but we are pursuing it. Because we want to be the voice of you, the Supervisor of Elections, the other groups that register people, but most of all, and most important, the voters that go out there and vote in this state. So please, talk to your legislators, write your letters to the editor, get the press involved, help educate, as the doctor so kindly said, help educate the voters so that they know what's happening before this election next November. Thank you.
I think it's important for the folks in the room today to know that, you know, this third-party voter registration is going to be a drawback to our voter registration here in Manatee County. I have always looked forward to the League and the Democratic and Republican Party going out and assisting us with registering to vote the people here. Now, when I took office, for the first 10 years, all I concentrated on was registering voters because we had very, very low rolls as far as the registration went. And then after about 11 years, I started looking and I'm saying, my gosh, we've got a great voter registration rolls here, but we don't have any turnout. And so then for the last 10 years, I've really concentrated on getting the voter turnout, which I have not been very successful on. But it's better than it was before. And once I stopped, and I had voter registration groups go into all of the churches. I still go to all the schools and register the high school students pre-election age and election age there. I try to concentrate very much on our youth. I think that is our future. I stay in constant contact with our seniors when they register to vote, even if they're not 18 yet. I put them in my database. When they turn 18, I send them a happy birthday letter telling them the responsibilities of voting and where they can vote, how they can vote, absentee, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. With this bill, it's not going to stop us from registering voters. I can assure you of that. Because we will start back again, and I've already talked to my staff about this, and they're excited about going back out to the churches, going back out, you know, to the different areas and registering voters. I can't tell you how much money the League of Women Voters and the party saved my office, because I'm paying time and a half every weekend that I send 15 people out to 9 locations. And if you don't know that the budgets have been cut by now, you've been in a hole someplace. My budget has been cut 10%. Every year for the last 3 years, and this year I just lucked out to keep it constant. So I will say that we are not going to suffer. It's not going to be fun, and we will still ask different groups to assist us in doing this under the auspices of my elections always falling up under the third-party registration. I will say one other thing, and I heard someone mention about, you know, students and the IDs. I can't begin to even tell you the security that we have with asking for a photo ID. You read about all the war stories all over the United States about absentee ballots, about people double voting, blocks of vote going in, they're not registered. I just got an email from someone I don't even know from Minnesota where they had 44 people walk into a polling location and voted that weren't registered to vote. Well, we don't have that problem here because we do have a photo ID. They have to show some form of photo ID. But, you know, that's not the end of the world either. I think one of the gentlemen here today said that if you cash a check, you got to have one. You know, if you're getting on an airplane, you got to have one. Well, you know, you don't have to have a driver's license to vote in Manatee County. You can have, I mean, we have a list, and I'll just share a couple of them with you. Driver's license, Florida ID for non-drivers, passport, student's ID, and I read that in the paper where it said students can't vote because they don't accept their ID. Well, that's garbage. They can here in the state of Florida. Credit cards, and if you do not have a photo ID with a signature on it, you can use a photo ID and a Social Security card or whatever with a signature on it. So we do not suppress voters from not being able to go to the polls and vote. Let me just cover one other thing, provisional ballots, about people moving into the county and not changing their address. Provisional ballots was the greatest thing that ever happened in the state of Florida. You might be delayed a little bit in your voting, but I will assure you no voter in the state of Florida, no voter in Manatee County, let me say that because I don't really control the rest of the state, but no voter in Manatee County is going to go to the polls and not be able to cast a ballot. And we, Judge Ferris is here today. He is one member of the canvassing board, and he will tell you that we go to extremes to make sure that we check these people out, and if there's any slight chance that they are able to vote, we make sure that they get to vote. Those provisional ballots are a pain in the butt to me, but they're great for the voter. They're absolutely wonderful because nobody gets turned away. I don't care if you're a felon or if you're not even registered to vote, you can vote a provisional ballot. Then it's up to me and my staff to research this to make sure that you're eligible to vote here in Manatee County. Getting back to moving into Manatee County, okay, maybe you're insulted just a little bit because you got to vote a provisional ballot because you did not change your address with us before the election. You vote a provisional ballot, and I call Sarasota County. They say, no, they didn't vote here, Bob. They were registered to vote here. I go to the state database. They are registered to vote with nothing against their record. We count that ballot. So everybody has an opportunity to vote. So there's no suppression when it comes to that. And I don't see that there's any suppression in Manatee County. Again, let me say, I only run this county. There is no suppression in Manatee County about a person registering to vote or voting. I have one case of fraud in all of my years that I've been here. I prosecuted that, and a liberal judge spanked their hands and gave them probation. That is a third-degree felony if you vote an absentee ballot and sign somebody else's name to it. And then if you steal the ballot out of the mailbox or out of the house, that's even worse. But anyway, one case in all the years that I've been here that I know of. Somebody asked me when I first came in here, do we have felons on the books in Manatee County? Yes. We do, for a lot of reasons. A lot of them are felons on the books here in Manatee County because they're in the process of being removed. Or maybe we just found out about it yesterday and we're in the process. So your elections are safe here in Manatee County, and I know there's a lot of controversy about this bill. And as I said when I first started, we get lemons, we make lemonade out of it here in Manatee County. So I think you're safe in knowing that your office is being run properly.
Okay, we have reached the time limit, so officially this meeting is over. However, if you would like to stay and hear some additional comments, you're more than welcome to. So with that, Richard?
Well, I'll keep it brief so we can get you folks out the door. Just to applaud Bob Sweat on one hand, because Bob has done a terrific job of registering voters, and also whenever we try to go to a high school, the supervisor of elections already been there, so they've done a real good job of that. And recently, we were looking to try to have the voice of the churches heard, because they kept coming to us and saying, "Hey, can we do voter registration?" And Bob Sweat stepped up to the plate and said that they would help us do it. The last question was, what would you recommend doing? And the recommendation I would say is, if you don't like the fact that your state is spending money to oppose your will in Amendment 5 and 6, then call up Rick Scott's office, call up Secretary of State Kurt Browning's office, call up your other legislature's office, and let them know. And the other thing is, as of January, the new session 2012 begins. The legislation that is commonly called the Voter Suppression Act, that can be reversed. And if a lot of folks call their legislators, it's more likely that they'll take it seriously. I'll tell you what, there is almost no chance that the racial profiling bill that passed the House and the Senate weren't going to be coupled, and yet that didn't become the law of the land. So you never know how powerful your voices are, especially those of you who know the legislators. The last thing I'd say is that even though I respect Bob a lot, and he feels that there will be no suppression. In my view, there's almost no way that there can't be suppression of turnout, and even if it's just a half or 5 or 0.7%, that's the margin that Alex Sink lost the election on. And what a different world it would be today if she were governor. That's what I have, and thank you.
The only quick question or thing that I would say is why would the Republicans, if there are 600,000 fewer Republican voters in the state of Florida than there are Democrats, want to suppress voter registration? Why wouldn't we pass the pro-Republican Voter Registration Act? And if there are 600,000 more registered Democratic voters in the state of Florida, why do Republicans control 70% of both houses? It's because we have to give credit to the voters for being intelligent, and both parties are minorities. The Republican Party is we're the smallest political voting bloc in the state of Florida. The Democrats are the second smallest voting bloc in the state of Florida, and it's the independents who swing the elections statewide and nationally. God bless you, and thank you for being here. I got to go back to my office.
Thank you very much. I want to thank MTV. I want to thank our panelists. Weren't they very, very, very good? So thank you all. Appreciate it. We're officially adjourned.